You see it all the time, right? You turn on the TV and there's the sprawling New York skyline, that chaotic energy of Wall Street, and that endless rolling ticker of green numbers. Every single day, we're bombarded with the exact same message from financial networks, glowing newspaper headlines, and, all the economic experts. They're constantly telling us about this roaring economy. Stocks are up, corporations are raking in literally billions in record profits. It sounds like an absolute triumph. But when we actually pull back the curtain today and look at the hard data, we're going to investigate a massive, glaring disconnect. Welcome to our explainer on the great economic disconnect, headlines versus reality.
I mean, you hear this phrase everywhere, don't you? The economy is strong. And to be perfectly fair, if we're just looking at the macroeconomic news, the numbers actually do look fantastic on paper. Unemployment remains relatively low. Consumer spending, broadly speaking, it's kept churning right along by all the traditional textbook metrics that we've historically used to gauge the financial health of the nation. Things look incredibly stable. But the real question is, does that stability actually reflect the world you live in? And that brings us to a pretty massive financial mystery. If the economy is doing so incredibly well, why do millions of Americans still feel like they are constantly falling behind? Just think about it for a second. Why does buying your weekly groceries hurt so much more than it used to just, a few years ago? Why does the dream of owning a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood feel completely impossible for so many working professionals? And why are more and more people relying on their credit cards just to bridge the gap to their next paycheck? These two realities, they're colliding in real time.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The answer to this mystery isn't as simple as just, pointing a finger at inflation and calling it a day. The paradox we're uncovering here is that the economy you see broadcasted on TV, the one celebrated by all those pundits in sleek television studios, it's simply not the economy that most Americans experience every single day when they sit down at the kitchen table to pay their bills. We are essentially living in a tale of two entirely different economies.
So when economists talk about the economy, they're usually looking at it from a 30,000-foot view. They rely on country-level data. And notice the metrics driving this whole narrative: gross domestic product, or GDP, and corporate profits over the last few years. By those specific measures, the United States has actually shown remarkable macroeconomic resilience. The bars are high, the trend is upward. But what happens when the metrics driving the narrative completely detach from the actual people living inside it? There's a massive flaw in using only this data to understand daily life, because these numbers, they describe the country as a whole, not necessarily the actual people living in it.
Imagine a neighborhood with 10 residents, okay? One person in this neighborhood earns $10 million a year, and the other 9 people earn almost nothing. On paper, if you average it out, the average income of that neighborhood looks absolutely incredible. The economic data of that street is incredibly strong. But the reality for 90% of the people living there, it feels very, very different. Well, that exact same statistical illusion can happen across an entire national economy. It skews the overall average and completely hides the struggles of the majority.
Which brings this whole investigation directly to you. Has your paycheck doubled in the last few years? For the vast majority of working Americans, the answer is a resounding no. Incomes for many have basically flatlined, or at best, maybe they've crept up by just a few percentage points. Yet while wages have remained relatively stagnant, the reality of our daily expenses has completely detached from our earning power. So where exactly is all that money going?
To really understand the squeeze, we have to look at the foundational costs of simply existing in modern society. We aren't talking about luxury cars or lavish vacations here. We're talking about rent, insurance, groceries, eating out at a modest restaurant, childcare, healthcare. The prices for these absolute essentials have risen sharply. And these aren't optional expenses, right? These are the core costs of living, and they're taking a much, much larger bite out of that stagnant paycheck than ever before.
So, the numbers tell a very different story than those optimistic headlines, especially when we talk about inflation. And there's a major misconception that needs to be cleared up right now. When you hear that inflation is slowing down, a lot of people naturally assume that means prices are going to drop back to where they were in, say, 2019. But do they ever actually drop back down? No. When inflation slows, prices usually don't return to where they started. They simply rise more slowly. The damage has already been done to the baseline. Families are locked in, and they're continuing to pay significantly more than they did just a few years earlier.
So if expenses have skyrocketed, but paychecks haven't doubled, we really have to ask the next logical question. How are people actually covering the difference? I mean, if the math doesn't add up, where is the extra money coming from to keep the lights on and the fridge stocked?
For many households, the answer is a pretty dark progression into debt. And notice how this escalation happens. Step 1 is usually just borrowing for convenience. You use a credit card to get some points, or you use a buy now, pay later tool for a quick purchase. But as expenses outpace income, we move to step 2, borrowing to stay afloat. This is using personal loans and credit just to buy groceries or pay utility bills. And finally, step 3, drowning in interest charges. When you can't pay off the balance, compounding interest makes that hole deeper and so much harder to climb out of. This scary part is, most people never notice this dangerous tipping point until they're already over the edge. What begins as a modern financial convenience quietly morphs into a desperate survival tactic. And really, how long can a foundation hold when it's built entirely on borrowed time? Because everyone is trying to keep up appearances, the neighborhood still looks totally fine from the outside, but inside those bank accounts, the pressure is immense. And this brings us to the absolute starkest contrast of our investigation today. On one side, you have Wall Street. They're celebrating record profits and a climbing stock market. On the exact same day, in the exact same economy, you have Main Street, where everyday families are struggling with higher living costs and mounting credit card debt. How can these two worlds exist simultaneously without one breaking the other? So why does a booming stock market leave so many people out in the cold? Honestly, it comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of what the market actually is. Stock prices are simply numbers that reflect expectations about businesses and future corporate earnings. They are absolutely not a reflection of personal financial situations or the health of the average consumer's wallet. A strong stock market doesn't automatically mean every household is doing well. In fact, a company might achieve those record profits precisely by raising prices on consumers or cutting jobs, which, yeah, it boosts their stock, but it directly hurts the average family. And here's exactly what the headlines don't explain. Because of everything we've just covered, two people can look at the exact same economy and come away with completely different, yet entirely valid, experiences. A corporate CEO looking at their stock portfolio sees a booming, thriving financial landscape. A single mother at the supermarket checkout seeing the price of milk and eggs, she sees a financial crisis. And you know what? They're both right. Which brings us to the ultimate question of this entire explainer. We see the macro data and we see the micro reality. So, is the economy actually strong or is it weak? The truth is, both statements can be true at the exact same time. We are literally living in two realities. On one hand, we have the economic indicators, strong GDP and low unemployment. The country is resilient. On the other hand, we have personal finances, high consumer debt, and relentlessly rising everyday costs. The people are struggling. The economic indicators tell one story, while personal finances tell another entirely. As an impartial observer of this data, we just have to accept that these two realities coexist, even when they fiercely contradict each other. Now comes the surprising part. Understanding this exact difference, this huge gap between the macro and the micro, is the key to decoding the financial news you hear every single day. Because what happens when you realize the data isn't measuring your life at all? Well, once you recognize that the data on TV isn't measuring your personal reality, the disconnect finally makes sense. You aren't crazy for feeling the pinch while some pundit tells you everything is fine. You're just looking at a different column of the spreadsheet. So, the next time you turn on the news or you open an article and you hear an expert make this sweeping, confident statement, the economy is doing great, I want you to pause. Just pause and remember the gap between the neighborhood average and the individuals actually living there. And I want you to ask one single powerful question. For whom? Because until that question is answered, the whole story hasn't been told. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the numbers. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking at the data, and we'll see you next time.